Tokyo, September 1945. The war is over, but the city still breathes smoke. Trolley wires hang like torn veins above shattered streets. The imperial palace walls cast long shadows across puddles of oil and ash. From behind the barbed gates of the Daiichi building, now the headquarters of the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, a sound rises that no one expected in this defeated capital. A jeep, not the heavy tread of a tank nor the bark of a command car, but a light, confident engine. At the wheel sits an American servicewoman, her khaki uniform crisp, her cap tilted just so. She eases the vehicle through the checkpoint, nods politely to the Japanese sentry, and smiles. On the sidewalk, two Japanese officers freeze mid-step. They had seen American bombers darken their skies, American Marines storm their islands, but never this. A woman soldier driving, commanding, unafraid. The image will stay with them long after the dust settles, the smile of victory not in fury, but in quiet control. Before 1941, few Americans could imagine a woman behind the wheel of an army truck. In the interwar years, gender lines were drawn with quiet certainty. Factories, shipyards, and motor pools were worlds of grease and grit. Men's work. Women belonged to the home, to schools, or to clerical desks. Even in the modern United States, the notion of women commanding vehicles under military authority seemed unthinkable. But war has a way of rearranging what nations believe about themselves. By late 1941, America faced a scale of mobilization unprecedented in its history. The attack on Pearl Harbor ripped through the illusion that oceans could protect the mainland. Millions of men were drafted within months, and the U.S. Army found itself short of everything: mechanics, drivers, clerks, messengers, telephone operators. For every combat soldier at the front, 7 were needed in the rear to supply him. Trucks, not tanks, would carry the weight of global war. It was General George C. Marshall who grasped the truth early. To win, America had to unlock the manpower and womanpower waiting on its own shores. Under his quiet but determined leadership, the War Department authorized a radical experiment. On May 15, 1942, President Roosevelt approved the creation of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, or WAC. Evita Culp Hobby, a lawyer and newspaper executive from Texas, was appointed its first director. Her orders were clear: build a disciplined, uniformed female service to take over non-combat military jobs and free men for the battlefield. Within weeks, recruiting posters appeared in post offices and factory halls. "Release a man for combat," they read. Women from every state answered: teachers, typists, farmhands, even debutantes. At Fort Des Moines, Iowa, the first training center opened in July 1942. Barracks, mess halls, parade grounds, classrooms, all converted for the Army's newest soldiers. Though Congress still called them auxiliaries, they drilled in khaki skirts, learned Army regulations, practiced map reading, radio signaling, and motor transport. At night, the lights in the motor school burned late as women studied carburetors and transmission diagrams. By summer 1943, Congress dropped the word auxiliary. The Women's Army Corps, the WAC, became part of the regular army. With that signature, over 150,000 women would serve in uniform before the war's end. Driving soon became one of the Corps' most critical specializations. The Army's motor pools were the arteries of the war. Thousands of vehicles moving mail, supplies, and personnel across hundreds of bases. Each driver trained to Army standards: vehicle inspection, convoy discipline, blackout driving, and emergency repair. Accidents were logged like casualties. At Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, recruits were tested on hill climbs, gear shifting, and tire changes under a strict time limit. One sergeant remembered they could handle a deuce and a half like they'd been born in it. The appearance of women behind the wheel changed the rhythm of the home front. Convoys of olive-drab trucks now had ponytailed drivers, gloves gripping the wheel, eyes steady on the road. They hauled everything from ammunition crates to medical supplies. Some served as dispatch drivers for generals. Others ferried wounded men between hospitals. Every mile driven released another man for the front, a quiet, measurable victory. Yet while the United States adapted, its enemies did not. In Imperial Japan, women's roles remained bound to home and family. Wartime propaganda idealized them as mothers and comforters of soldiers, not soldiers themselves. Female mobilization existed, but largely through volunteer labor in factories, nursing and community support organizations like the Greater Japan Women's Association. The sight of a woman driving a military truck, much less in command of it, would have seemed alien, even absurd, to most Japanese officers. Across the Pacific, however, Allied armies were proving the opposite. Britain's Auxiliary Territorial Service, Canada's Canadian Women's Army Corps, and the Soviet Union's famed female pilots and snipers demonstrated that gender lines could be redrawn in the name of survival. The United States, slow to begin, accelerated rapidly. By 1944, WACS operated motor pools in North Africa, Italy, and Britain. In each theater, they carried dispatches through blackout cities, maintained jeeps under shell fire, and delivered supplies along routes choked with mud and fear. Every driver's logbook told the same quiet story. Miles completed, loads delivered, engines checked. But together, those numbers defined industrial warfare's true miracle: movement. The truck, as simple as it seemed, was what allowed the United States to fight a global war on two oceans at once. Back in Washington, Oveta Culp Hobby briefed Congress, "Our women have not only driven well, they have driven history forward." Her statement was more prophetic than anyone yet realized. From these stateside training grounds and convoy routes, the transformation was complete. America had turned ordinary women into soldiers, drivers, and technicians. The next chapter of that story would unfold thousands of miles away, when Japanese officers, standing amid the ruins of their empire, finally came face to face with the reality those women represented. The truck was the heartbeat of modern war. Steel, rubber, and gasoline, nothing symbolized American power more than movement. From 1942 onward, factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Toledo ran day and night, producing more than 2 million military trucks. The most famous of all was the GMC CCKW-2 1.2-ton 6x6, known simply as the Deuce and a Half, rugged, reliable, and built with interchangeable parts. It could climb slopes, ford streams, and haul 3 tons of cargo without complaint. To drive it was to command an empire of supply. By 1943, the Women's Army Corps had their own motor schools dedicated to the CCKW and the smaller Dodge WC-3 4-ton. They learned to double clutch, to back in formation, to keep convoys at 40 yards, spacing under blackout conditions. A single mistake could cause a pile-up costing lives and equipment. But women proved steady under pressure. Reports from Fort Oglethorpe and Fort Des Moines showed that accident rates among female drivers were lower than among men. Skill, not gender, determined survival. As the Allied advance stretched across continents, logistics became a military science. Each campaign, from the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of France, demanded rivers of fuel, food, and ammunition. The U.S. Army's Red Ball Express, that legendary convoy system feeding Patton's Third Army in 1944, was staffed largely by African-American male drivers. Yet behind the front lines, women in WAC units and the American Red Cross clubmobiles kept similar systems running: coffee, donuts, cigarettes, and comfort for millions of troops. They drove 3-ton trucks through rain and blackout zones, sometimes under air raid sirens, delivering morale as vital as rations. In Britain, more than 30,000 WACs served by late 1944. They handled typewriters, radios, and steering wheels with equal authority. Commanders noticed the discipline. Convoys arrived on time. Records were precise. One general remarked, "The men treat them with respect because they earn it mile by mile." When victory in Europe came in May 1945, attention shifted to the Pacific. There the distances were vaster and the conditions harsher. The U.S. Army allowed only limited deployment of WAC units to the Pacific theater, primarily in safe rear areas such as Hawaii, New Guinea, the Philippines, and later Okinawa. But even there, the sight of American women operating jeeps, dispatch cars, and transport trucks left a deep impression. They worked in tropical heat, wore mosquito netting over helmets, and kept engines running in monsoon mud. Japanese troops rarely saw them in person during the fighting. Propaganda painted them as caricatures of American decadence. Yet intelligence officers gathered reports hinting at something far more complex. A society so industrialized and mobilized that even its women were part of the machine. Japanese military observers, reading captured documents or listening to intercepted radio traffic, noted references to female personnel in transportation. The Imperial Army's psychological warfare units dismissed it as American exaggeration until the war ended and the occupation began, when Japan surrendered in August 1945. The Allied occupation plan under General Douglas MacArthur required an enormous logistical network. The U.S. 8th Army alone needed thousands of vehicles to move personnel, equipment, and relief supplies across Honshu and Kyushu. Motor transport companies were rebuilt overnight, and among the drivers who arrived on the first troop ships into Yokohama were women of the Women's Army Corps. They were not combatants. Their mission was administration, communication, and supply. But symbolically, their arrival meant something larger, the full weight of the United States, industrial, social, and moral, entering the heart of a defeated empire. In September 1945, Tokyo was a broken city. Trams half buried in rubble, streets without lights. The Imperial Hotel still stood, charred but defiant. As occupation forces took control, the military motor pools began to hum with engines again. Jeeps, Dodges, and 6X6 trucks moved through the avenues, marked with white stars. Behind the wheels sometimes was a woman in olive drab, clipboard on her knee, cap tilted just right. She wasn't a nurse or secretary, she was an army driver. For many Japanese officers raised in a culture where hierarchy and gender were rigid, the sight was a quiet shock. During the war, Japan's propaganda had portrayed the United States as materialistic, decadent, and morally weak, a land of luxury unfit for total war. Yet here, in the ashes of their own capital, were women operating military vehicles with professional precision, calm, efficient, smiling. It wasn't just a cultural difference. It was a living demonstration of America's industrial democracy, a system so vast and confident that it could train anyone, regardless of gender, to keep the machine of war moving. To Japanese officers, accustomed to rigid order and male dominance, the idea that a smiling woman could represent power was disorienting. Occupation headquarters at the Daiichi building, across from the Imperial Palace, became the administrative brain of this new era. Truck drivers ferried staff officers, documents and equipment between depots. They obeyed the same traffic protocols as any soldier, saluting MPs, logging mileage, refueling by schedule. For the first time in history, the streets of Tokyo carried American vehicles, piloted by women in uniform. In the months that followed, this quiet revolution of routine would transform not just logistics, but perception. Because sometimes victory doesn't roar through the sky or march in columns. Sometimes it simply drives by, waves politely, and keeps the engine running. Angle A, the human angle. Every war reshapes ordinary people before it reshapes nations. The women who became drivers for the U.S. Army were never born soldiers. They were teachers, librarians, farmhands, or telephone clerks. Yet within a few months, they learned to handle engines, navigate convoys, and follow orders as crisply as any infantryman. Letters home tell the story best. Private First Class Helen Richards of New York wrote from Fort Des Moines in 1943, "I grease the trucks every night. I never thought I'd be proud of oil on my hands. But when you drive, you feel part of something larger than any one of us." Many WACs shared that feeling. They rose at dawn, drilled in perfect lines, passed drivers' inspections, and logged their miles with the precision of flight hours. They learned the smell of diesel, the clatter of gears, and the fatigue of 200-mile convoys. There was no glamour in it, only purpose. Their uniforms drew stares at first. Even American men, unused to seeing women in khaki, often questioned them. But discipline silenced doubt. By the time they deployed overseas, these women carried themselves like veterans, focused, proud, and fully aware that their service blurred the very lines society once drew to define them. For every soldier at the front, there was a woman somewhere behind him who kept the supply route alive. It was a kind of invisible courage, one that Japan, steeped in tradition, could hardly have imagined. Angle B. The tactical angle in modern warfare. Movement is survival. Every bullet, ration, and radio battery had to travel hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles before it reached the front. Trucks became as vital as rifles. The United States called this principle the mobility of war. Each WAC driver represented not novelty, but necessity. A single motor pool might handle 200 vehicles, each requiring constant checks for fuel, oil, and tire pressure. Drivers operated in convoy formations, often through blackout zones where only the faint red of a tail light ahead kept them aligned. They learned to follow hand signals, not voices, and to react instantly when a lead truck braked or turned. A trained driver could move a 3-ton truck loaded with artillery shells across slick cobblestones or muddy roads. She could diagnose a bad clutch, change a tire under rain, or restart an engine with a hand crank. In war, these were life-saving skills. By 1944, WAC drivers in Europe had already proven their tactical worth. Reports from the ETO, European Theatre of Operations, detailed convoys staffed partly by women that maintained 97% delivery efficiency under pressure. It was an invisible triumph. No medals, no parades, but commanders noticed. The same efficiency would later be replicated in occupied Japan, where women kept headquarters running on time and supplies moving through Tokyo's new military grid. To the Japanese eye, the tactical discipline of these convoys, engines starting simultaneously, vehicles turning with clockwork precision, reflected not chaos but control. The United States had not only conquered through firepower, but through logistics powered by ordinary citizens trained into soldiers. A woman behind the wheel was not a symbol of weakness. She was evidence that America could organize even its domestic life into instruments of war. Angle C. The technological angle technology was America's silent ally. The vehicles these women drove were masterpieces of industrial standardization. The GMC CCKW, Dodge WC, and Jeep Willys MB were built to be interchangeable, repairable, and endlessly adaptable. Each truck came with detailed manuals, pictorial diagrams, and spare parts kits. A driver who followed procedure could strip, clean, and reassemble key components in minutes. The WAC motor transport courses reflected this philosophy. Women were trained to understand the machinery they commanded, not just to drive it. They memorized engine layouts, practiced gear ratios, and learned how to use torque wrenches and jacks safely. Many instructors later admitted their female trainees handled maintenance more methodically than men, following instructions to the letter. In a war where broken vehicles could strand entire units, this precision mattered. The truck became a rolling testament to American production. Factories in Detroit, Akron, and Toledo didn't just build machines. They built confidence. When a WAC driver stepped into her truck, she wasn't just operating a vehicle. She was extending the reach of that vast industrial network across oceans and battlefields. By contrast, Japan's logistical infrastructure lagged behind. The Imperial Army relied heavily on horses, rail, and human porters. Fuel shortages crippled mobility. Trucks were scarce, spare parts scarcer, and standardization virtually non-existent. Japanese officers who later watched Allied convoys move through Tokyo understood at once what they had faced, a war machine so large and efficient that it could train women halfway across the world to drive its arteries without missing a beat. In the silence after surrender, they would stand on curbs and watch those vehicles glide past. The engines purred evenly, the drivers saluted smartly, and one might smile out of simple courtesy. But to the men who had built their world on hierarchy and order, that smile carried an unspoken truth. The future now belonged to nations that could trust both men and women to drive it forward. The human will, the tactical rhythm, and the mechanical perfection. Together they formed the triad of American logistics. Yet behind every moving convoy stood leadership, the minds that believed women could and should serve. That story of vision, acceptance, and cultural contrast comes next. Angle D. Leadership. Every revolution begins with someone willing to sign a piece of paper that changes the rules. In the story of America's women drivers, that signature belonged to General George C. Marshall, the calm architect of victory. When he backed the creation of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in 1942, he did more than fill manpower gaps. He quietly redefined who could serve the nation. His rationale was practical. Logistics needed people. His faith was moral. Women could meet military standards if given the chance. Beside him stood Oveta Culp Hobby, whose organizational genius turned vision into reality. Under her command, the Women's Army Corps became one of the most efficient administrative and transport arms of the U.S. military. Hobby insisted that women follow the same code of discipline and decorum as men. "We are soldiers," she reminded recruits, "serving without weapons but with duty no less demanding." Her policies emphasized competence and self-respect. Wakis were trained not to imitate men, but to professionalize their own standards. That subtle difference, pride without mimicry, gave the Corps its distinctive character. They did not seek equality through rebellion. They earned it through reliability. In the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur quickly understood the political value of this discipline. When planning the post-war occupation of Japan, he ordered that WAC units be included among headquarters staff. They symbolized order, stability, and efficiency, exactly the image he wanted to project. The presence of uniformed American women at the heart of the new administration carried a deliberate message. This occupation was not one of vengeance, but of reconstruction under civility and control. It was leadership that understood perception as power, and nowhere would that perception strike harder than in the minds of Japan's own officers, who had built their empire on a completely opposite philosophy. Angle E, the enemy's view for Japanese officers. The war had been fought under a strict social code. Women were revered as mothers and supporters of men, not as uniformed equals. The Japanese home front had seen women labor in munitions plants, tend fields, and nurse the wounded, but always within defined limits of modesty and obedience. The notion of a woman driving a military truck through the imperial capital was beyond imagination. During the war, Japanese propaganda painted American society as decadent and chaotic, a land of excess, jazz, and moral weakness. "A nation of women and machines," one broadcast sneered, "that cannot endure hardship." That phrase, meant as insult, would prove prophetic. America was a nation of women and machines, and that combination had just crushed the empire that mocked it. In September 1945, Japanese officers witnessed the truth firsthand. They saw women in pressed khaki, hair neatly pinned, steering jeeps through the same streets once reserved for imperial parades. These were not entertainers or nurses, they were soldiers. Their posture was firm, their movements disciplined, their behavior restrained. No arrogance, no gloating, just professionalism. For many Japanese men, it was the first time they had looked directly at a woman who represented authority. Some reacted with disbelief, others with curiosity, a few with respect. The power dynamic they had always assumed, male control, female subservience, seemed inverted in a single moment. Yet the woman in the driver's seat showed no sense of domination. She was simply doing her job. That calm competence made a deeper impression than any victory parade. The silent message was unmistakable. The United States had mastered not only industry, but social adaptability, the ability to mobilize its entire population without collapsing its culture. Japan, for all its devotion and sacrifice, had been defeated by a society that trusted its women with responsibility. Angle F. Moral and psychological power. Not every weapon in war explodes. Some disarm simply by existing. The sight of a uniformed American woman smiling behind the wheel was one of those quiet detonations. It signaled a form of power that did not rely on fear, a power expressed through normalcy, confidence, and dignity. To the American soldiers stationed in Tokyo, their female comrades embodied the peace they wanted to preserve. To the Japanese, they represented the human face of the conqueror, composed, courteous, yet unmistakably in command. Newspapers began describing the occupation as unusually disciplined. Civilians, though wary, noticed that the Americans treated women within their own ranks with respect. The contrast to Japan's wartime gender hierarchy was profound. Psychologists working under the Civil Information and Education section of the occupation later noted an unexpected phenomenon. Japanese civilians were more likely to accept new democratic reforms, especially those involving women's rights, after repeated, everyday encounters with female military personnel. It wasn't political theory that persuaded them. It was visibility. A woman in uniform driving a truck, handling documents, or giving directions on a Tokyo street made abstract ideals tangible. The smile that Japanese officers remembered was not one of triumph. It was the smile of composure. It said without words that power could coexist with grace. America had found a new form of influence, what would later be called soft power. The discipline of its military women became the moral mirror of the nation itself, organized, polite, efficient, but unyielding. When these WACs passed Japanese civilians bowing politely by the roadside, they didn't wave flags or shout slogans. They followed the convoy schedule. Engines steady, paperwork precise. Every movement became a lesson in the authority of routine. The quiet confidence of a nation that could rebuild as effectively as it fought. That balance of discipline and humanity would define the occupation's tone, and it all began with the simplest of images, a woman, a truck, and a smile that outlasted the sound of war. The leadership had set the stage, the enemy had witnessed the shock, and the moral weight had settled like calm after thunder. Now comes the moment when these threads converge, the turning point when Tokyo, still smoldering, realized that power had changed its shape. Tokyo, late September 1945, morning fog rises from the Sumida River, wrapping the shattered skyline in grey silk. The Imperial Palace moats reflect broken bridges and the silhouettes of soldiers directing traffic. Along Hibiadori, engines rumble where silence once ruled. Jeeps, Dodge weapons carriers, and GMC cargo trucks form convoys between the Daiichi building and Yokohama's port. The occupation is not only a military operation, it is an act of movement, order, restoring chaos. At 700 hours, a small motor pool inside the Daiichi compound comes to life. Drivers assemble in formation, WAC insignia on sleeves, clipboards in hand. The motor sergeant, a woman scarcely 25, checks her roster, calls names, and issues keys. Oil levels, tire pressures, mileage logs, all verified in crisp efficiency. The engines turn over in unison, exhaust curling into the pale air. A new rhythm has entered the city. Among those who watch are Japanese staff officers attached to the Demobilization Bureau across the avenue. They wear faded khaki, swords removed, insignia stripped of rank. They stand behind the low wall and observe what looks like routine. But to them, it is extraordinary. The women at the wheel are soldiers. They start, reverse, and shift gears with professional ease. Their posture is straight, their faces calm. When an MP halts the lead truck at the intersection, the driver leans forward, salutes, and proceeds. No hesitation, no uncertainty. For the first time in living memory, Japanese officers witness women operating under martial authority in their own capital, not as victims or auxiliaries, but as equals within a victorious army. The moment is small, yet seismic. No speeches, no banners, just trucks in motion, tires crushing ash, engines steady against the morning chill. A staff colonel later wrote in his diary, "They moved as if the war had not touched them. We lost everything, and yet they smiled." It was unbearable, but also admirable. The occupation planners at General MacArthur's headquarters knew this effect was inevitable. It was not an accident that the Women's Army Corps served in visible administrative and logistical roles. They were the bridge between authority and reassurance. Their presence softened the image of military power without diminishing its discipline. Where armed men might inspire fear, these women represented continuity, the machinery of order resuming its function after the storm. In a city that had starved under bombardment, even the sight of moving vehicles symbolized life returning. Food convoys, medical deliveries, document runs, all executed on schedule. The efficiency of these operations impressed both allies and former enemies. A Japanese interpreter assigned to GHQ noted that the Americans seemed to have endless trucks, and all of them arrived on time, even when driven by women. We could not imagine how such abundance was possible. It was possible because the American system had fused democracy with industrial precision. The war machine that once bombed Tokyo from the sky was now rebuilding it from the ground, led in part by the very citizens who had fueled it at home. Every truck that rolled through the capital was a moving symbol of that transformation. To Japanese society, steeped in the belief that hierarchy and restraint defined civilization, the calm authority of a woman driver carried moral weight. It wasn't defiance, it was assurance. She didn't command by force, yet everything around her obeyed her command. Traffic yielded, civilians bowed, sentries saluted. The power she represented came not from conquest, but from competence. By October, the sight had become familiar. Convoys of olive-drab vehicles rumbled past the imperial palace each dawn. Some carried rations, others documents or mail. In each, a driver's gloved hands gripped the wheel, steady, confident, indifferent to the stairs. The initial shock among Japanese officers faded into something else. Reflection. Many began to ask questions quietly, almost guiltily. How had America trained women to such precision? How had it convinced them that this service was honorable, not shameful? How had a society capable of such equality also defeated an empire built on discipline? The answer, though unspoken, unfolded before their eyes. America's discipline came not from obedience to hierarchy, but from faith in systems, education, organization, and the idea that duty belonged to anyone willing to shoulder it. In the wake of Hiroshima and surrender, that idea proved more powerful than any bomb. One photograph from that autumn captures the essence of the turning point. A jeep pauses beside the moat. Behind the wheel sits a whack corporal, expression neutral but posture proud. In the back seat, a Japanese interpreter adjusts his briefcase. Across the water, two imperial guards watch silently from the gate. Nothing moves except the reflection of the jeep in the still water, a mirror image of the old and the new Japan facing each other. For that moment, the occupation was distilled into a single frame, defeat transformed into order, pride into observation, and hostility into understanding. The war had begun with slogans about racial superiority and divine mission. It ended with a quiet lesson in professionalism. Every day that autumn, as those trucks rolled through the city, the same thought echoed through Tokyo's corridors of power. The Americans had not just conquered with weapons, they had conquered with civilization itself, and yet the story did not end at the motor pool gates. The true climax unfolded beyond the checkpoints, along the long routes between Yokohama docks, Tokyo warehouses, and airfields, where the machinery of peace was being assembled from the wreckage of war. The intersection had shown Japan its new reality. Now the open road would reveal what reconstruction truly looked like, power expressed not in battle, but in motion. By October 1945, the U.S. occupation of Japan had settled into its rhythm. The guns were silent, but the engines were never still. From dawn until dusk, convoys rolled through the ruins, from the Yokohama piers to supply depots at Shinjuku, and from the Imperial Palace to the airfields at Tachikawa and Atsugi. The people of Tokyo, once forbidden even to look directly at occupying soldiers, now watched from sidewalks as the endless line of olive-drab vehicles passed. Children waved, some mothers bowed, others simply stood in silence, trying to comprehend how swiftly the conqueror had become the caretaker. Amid these convoys were the trucks that drew the most attention, those driven by women. They were not numerous, but they were visible. Each bivouac driver wore the same pressed khaki uniform, the same peaked cap tilted just so, the same gloved hands gripping the wheel. Some were barely 20 years old, yet they maneuvered heavy trucks through traffic with unshakable confidence. Their discipline was military, their presence profoundly human. A WAC motor pool at Yokohama managed over 100 vehicles, shuttling officers, mail, and medical equipment daily. The maintenance yard echoed with the sound of wrenches and engines, women tightening bolts, checking tires, marking mileage logs in neat handwriting. A sign at the entrance read, "Safety is military courtesy." It could have hung in any factory in Detroit. But here, in a country that had worshipped machines as sacred tools of empire, it now symbolized something different. The machinery of recovery. One Japanese civilian engineer later recalled his first inspection visit. "When I saw the American woman driver back her truck into position, align it exactly to the dock and dismount to salute her officer, I felt something break inside me. We had lost not only the war, but the illusion that women must always stand behind men." For the Japanese public, still reeling from defeat and hunger, the American women seemed both foreign and familiar. They embodied efficiency without arrogance, a mixture of strength and civility that contrasted sharply with wartime propaganda. Newspapers under MacArthur's censorship guidelines were careful to portray occupation forces as disciplined and humane. Photographs of WACs and Red Cross workers appeared regularly, framed as symbols of order and reconstruction. The image of a woman in uniform driving through Tokyo became shorthand for the new era, the era of peace enforced through professionalism. At the GHQ motor pool, each morning began with the same ceremony: roll call, vehicle assignment, inspection, departure. At exactly 7:30, engines roared to life and the day's schedule began. One convoy would deliver correspondence to the Ministry of Finance. Another would carry engineers to a damaged bridge across the Sumida. Each route was timed to the minute. Delays were rare. In a culture that prized punctuality and precision, the Japanese recognized something familiar. But now it was being demonstrated by the former enemy. The discipline they had once claimed as their own had been matched, even surpassed, by the very nation they had mocked as soft. It was a psychological turning point more devastating than any bomb. The Japanese officers assigned to liaison duties began to take notes. They studied the Americans' organizational charts, their maintenance cycles, their convoy procedures. What they discovered astonished them. Every process was standardized, every part interchangeable, every role clearly defined. There was no mystery, no sacred hierarchy, only training, manuals, and accountability. It was a system that worked because people believed in the rules, not in the rank of those who issued them. In one report, filed by a former Imperial Army logistics officer in November 1945, a single line captured the revelation: they trust their women because they trust their system. We trusted only our superiors, and that was our undoing. The convoys became silent classrooms. Each jeep that passed, each saluted driver, each recorded delivery was a lesson in democracy translated into motion. America's greatest weapon had not been the atom bomb. It was the ability to organize chaos into order and to let everyone, even a young woman, share in that order. Beyond Tokyo, the same pattern repeated. At Yokohama's Red Cross depot, Women operated clubmobile trucks, rolling canteens, serving coffee and music to homesick troops. At Fukuoka and Nagoya, WAC clerks coordinated the distribution of supplies through teletype and motor dispatch. And on Okinawa, still scarred by battle, female drivers braved washed-out roads to deliver medical cargo to field hospitals. They did it without complaint, without seeking recognition. Their consistency became a kind of quiet anthem of victory. The Japanese press, under supervision, called it the new face of America. Even those who resented the occupation admitted a grudging respect. A Tokyo newspaper editor wrote privately in December 1945, "Our officers once laughed at the idea of women in uniform. Now they watch them pass with silence. Their smile carries no mockery. It is the smile of people who know how to rebuild." By the end of that year, the sight had become routine. We see trucks idled beside rickshaw pullers. Japanese policemen directed traffic alongside American MPs. Civilians shared the roads once reserved for the military. The contrast between the past and the present could not have been sharper. For the Japanese officers who had survived the war, each convoy was a reminder of what their nation had lacked. Not courage, not devotion, but flexibility. America's strength had come from inclusion, Japan's weakness from exclusion. In the long silence of surrender, that truth echoed louder than the bombings ever had. One afternoon in November, near the Ginza district, a Japanese colonel stood by a shattered storefront as a whack-driven jeep passed. He removed his cap and bowed slightly, a gesture unthinkable a year earlier. The driver slowed, nodded politely, and drove on. That simple exchange, respect offered, respect returned, captured the true turning point of the occupation. The war had ended in destruction. But peace, it seemed, would be driven forward by engines and understanding, by the same hands that once typed letters, sewed uniforms, and built airplanes. Hands that now guided the wheel of a new world. The convoys would keep rolling through the winter of 1945, carrying not weapons but blueprints, maps, and hope. From those miles of asphalt and discipline emerged the quiet revolution that would reshape Japan's society and America's military forever. The occupation of Japan lasted 7 years. During that time, the trucks never stopped moving. The women who drove them remained largely invisible in official histories, but their presence shaped the rhythm of early reconstruction. Within months of surrender, Japan's transport system, shattered by bombing and fuel shortages, depended almost entirely on Allied vehicles. The U.S. Eighth Army, headquartered in Yokohama, managed more than 40,000 trucks, jeeps, and trailers across Honshu and Kyushu. At least several hundred were operated or supervised by members of the Women's Army Corps. These women became part of the quiet bureaucracy that kept Japan functioning. They delivered rations to schools, transported engineers to rebuild power stations, and escorted Red Cross workers to refugee camps. Most never appeared in newspapers, but they were everywhere, steady, punctual, precise. To the Japanese public, they embodied the strange efficiency of the New World Order. Soldiers without aggression, authority without cruelty. Reports from 1946 describe how the GHQ motor pools were among the most admired departments of the occupation. Japanese observers noted the cleanliness of the vehicles, the courtesy of the drivers, and the absence of corruption. Traffic accidents involving WAC drivers were statistically rare. Their professionalism contrasted sharply with the chaos of post-war civilian transport, where fuel theft and bribery were common. American discipline, even in the smallest tasks, became a form of soft governance. The effect extended beyond logistics. Every day that a woman in uniform drove through Tokyo, she challenged old assumptions. Photographs of wax at the wheel circulated in Japanese magazines under the occupation's press code. Captioned in neutral, factual language, they still carried moral weight. The idea that a woman could serve the state directly, not through her husband or family, was revolutionary. It aligned perfectly with MacArthur's vision of a democratic Japan. In December 1945, The Civil Information and Education Section, CIE, began promoting reforms based on equality, literacy, and political rights. Among its earliest directives was the inclusion of women in public office. The new constitution, promulgated in November 1946, declared the equality of the sexes under the law. In April that same year, Japanese women voted for the first time in national elections. Nearly 13 million ballots were cast by women. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Just months earlier, many of those same women had watched American servicewomen drive confidently through their capital. Now they too were taking the wheel of their country's future. Cultural shifts followed. The image of the American woman in uniform began to appear in Japanese art, literature, and film, often as a symbol of modernity rather than occupation. Advertisements used the motif of the driving woman to sell everything from bicycles to sewing machines. She represented motion, independence, and recovery. In subtle ways, the occupation's logistical routine had rewritten Japan's visual language. Meanwhile, for the Women's Army Corps, the occupation became both a test and a transition. Demobilization pressures mounted as the war ended, but many officers argued to keep WACs overseas to stabilize post-war operations. Between 1945 and 1947, several thousand remained on duty in Asia, serving in Japan, the Philippines, and Guam. They handled administrative records, motor transport, and communications, roles that proved indispensable during the chaotic early years of rebuilding. General MacArthur personally praised the Corps service, calling it a demonstration that discipline and dignity need no distinction of gender. The War Department echoed the sentiment, noting that the presence of women in the occupation aided in establishing the image of order and efficiency before the Japanese people. Yet, for all their contributions, few of these women received public recognition. They completed their tours, turned in their uniforms, and went home to quiet lives. Some married fellow soldiers, others returned to teaching or nursing, but the habits they carried, precision, confidence, and pride, became part of post-war American life. The seeds of the later Women's Armed Services Integration Act, 1948, were already planted in the streets of Tokyo. In those first post-war years, every convoy that rolled through Japan carried more than supplies. It carried ideals. The old world had been built on hierarchy. The new one moved on wheels of equality, greased by discipline and respect. And as the 1946 elections approached, even the Japanese newspapers admitted it. The women who drive have taught us that democracy is also a skill, to be practiced daily, calmly, and without fear. From these first ripples of change would come deeper transformations in both militarizers, both nations, and both genders. What began as routine transport in a conquered city would soon redefine the structure of armies and societies alike. By 1947, Tokyo had begun to heal. Electric trams clattered again, schools reopened, and new factories rose from the ruins. The occupation forces thinned as Japanese ministries assumed responsibility for their own affairs. But the influence of those early American women lingered, not in parades or monuments, but in habits and expectations. For the Women's Army Corps, the occupation of Japan became a case study in endurance and adaptation. When demobilization swept through the U.S. Army after VJ Day, thousands of men left the service. Yet many officers argued that the WAC had proven too valuable to dissolve. Logistics, communications, and administration required continuity. In 1948, the U.S. Congress passed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, formally granting women permanent status in the regular and reserve forces. For the first time in American history, women could serve as regular soldiers, not temporary auxiliaries. This act was more than legislation. It was acknowledgement. The quiet professionalism of the WACs in Europe, the Pacific, and occupied Japan had changed minds within the War Department itself. Their motor pools had run on time. Their records had been flawless. Their behavior under pressure had silenced skeptics. What began as an emergency measure in 1942 had become a permanent institution by 1948. The United States Army would never again be entirely male. Technology also evolved. The humble truck, the deuce and a half that women once drove through Tokyo's ruins, remained a symbol of mobility. Logistics doctrine after 1945 treated motor transport not as background support, but as a decisive element of military power. The Korean War, only 5 years later, would confirm the lesson. Wars are won not only by who fights hardest, but by who moves fastest. In that sense, the women of the WAC had been pioneers in a revolution of speed and supply. In Japan, the influence took a different form. The democratic reforms introduced under MacArthur's occupation reshaped education, industry, and gender relations. The 1946 Constitution's guarantee of equality began to seep into everyday life. Women entered civil service, joined police ranks, and attended universities in growing numbers. By the 1950s, Japan's labor force had changed permanently, and though few acknowledged it publicly, the image of American women drivers during the occupation remained a silent reference point. Cultural historians later described it as the normalization of confidence. Before 1945, a woman behind the wheel had been a rarity in Japan. By the 1960s, it was commonplace. The automobile itself, once a military tool of occupation, became a national obsession of prosperity. Car commercials in post-war Japan often featured women driving with poise and calm, visual echoes of the WACs who had once steered trucks through Hibiadori. The transformation was not immediate nor complete, but the seed was planted. Power could be expressed through competence, not dominance. American occupation policy, which aimed to demilitarize without humiliation, relied on precisely that symbolism. The image of the courteous, disciplined female soldier reinforced the message that democracy was neither chaos nor weakness. It was order maintained through consent and cooperation. Japanese observers took note. Many post-war bureaucrats modeled their own systems of punctuality, documentation, and procedure after what they had witnessed. In GHQ's offices and motor pools, a 1951 Ministry of Transport report acknowledged that American administrative methods introduced a new sense of timeliness and efficiency, and that the inclusion of women in positions of authority contributed to a more civil mode of command. It was an extraordinary admission from a nation once bound by rigid patriarchy. By the time the occupation formally ended in 1952, the world had changed. The American trucks departed, their engines echoing for the last time through Tokyo's rebuilt streets. Some WACs stayed behind as civilians, working in embassies or aid programs. Others returned home to America, carrying stories that seemed unbelievable to those who had never seen the ruins firsthand. Yet wherever they went, they carried themselves with the same composure that had once stopped Japanese officers in their tracks. History rarely records their names, but the legacy of those women runs like an unseen road beneath both nations, paved with discipline, dignity, and the belief that competence knows no gender. The occupation faded, but its lessons endured. In every modern army where women serve openly, in every democracy that prizes participation over hierarchy, in every convoy that values precision over pride, there runs the echo of those first engines that rolled through the ruins of Tokyo. And from those ruins, a question still lingers, one that neither victory nor defeat could erase. What does it mean when the power to rebuild looks different from the power that destroyed? Morning light again over Tokyo. The air is clear now, the rubble swept away, the streets paved smooth where craters once gaped. The Daiichi building still stands across from the Imperial Palace, its facade unchanged, but the traffic outside tells a new story. Buses, taxis, bicycles, and the low hum of civilian trucks fill the avenues where olive-drab convoys once rolled. A city reborn through motion. Somewhere in an archive, a black and white photograph captures what words cannot. A young American servicewoman, hair pinned neatly under her cap, sits behind the wheel of a jeep. Her eyes are calm, her posture exact. She looks neither triumphant nor weary, only steady. Beside her, a Japanese child watches from the curb, mouth half open as if glimpsing the future. That image, more than the surrender documents or parades, defined the quiet revolution of 1945. It wasn't a war won by fury, but by function, by those who understood that order itself could heal. In the years that followed, both nations learned the same truth in different languages. Power is not proven only on battlefields. Sometimes it resides in a hand that turns a key, a wheel that stays straight, a smile that disarms more than a weapon ever could. For Japan, the lesson was humility turned into progress. For America, it was confidence turned into inclusion. Together, they found that rebuilding required more courage than conquest. If history has a sound, it is not always the roar of artillery. Sometimes it is the steady idle of an engine, the rustle of paper in a logbook, the rhythm of discipline continuing after victory. And if history has a face, it may well be hers. A woman in uniform driving through a city once destroyed, smiling not in triumph but in purpose, carrying the weight of a nation's recovery in both hands. Every war left behind a lesson. Don't miss the next one. Subscribe for more forgotten chapters of WW2.